Now let's take a look at the most important things you need to know about the 2017 French presidential election. In France, the president is elected directly by the people in a vote of 1 or 2 rounds. If no candidate obtains an absolute majority in the first round on Sunday, the 2 top will go through to a runoff on May the 7th, and the winner of that contest will be sworn in as president by May the 14th. At the latest, 11 candidates are vying for the top job. Nearly 47 million voters are registered for that election, and more than 65,000 polling stations will open at 0600 GMT. The outcome will not be known until after the final stations close at 1800 GMT. The 5th extension of the state of emergency imposed after the terrorist attacks of 2015 lasts until July the 15th of 2017. And that makes this election the first in the history of France's 59-year-old Fifth Republic to take place under such a state. Over 50,000 police and 7,000 soldiers are deployed to patrol during the vote. Now, the presidential race has tightened, with opinion polls showing a neck-and-neck race for the 4 main candidates. They are far-left candidate Jean-Luc Melenchon, centrist Emmanuel Macron, conservative Francois Fillon, and far-rightist Marine Le Pen.
In a survey released on Sunday, 24.5% of the respondents said they would vote for Macron. Le Pen improved her score by 1 percentage point to 23, while Fillon and Melenchon were both at 19%. So who are these 4 leading candidates, and what are their political positions? Let's take a look. Far-right candidate Jean-Luc Melenchon stands for environmental principles, the redistribution of wealth, renegotiating EU treaties, and maintaining an independent stance, namely from the United States. The centrist Macron has explicitly expressed his pro-European ideas and intends to implement reforms to modernise the French economy. Conservative Francois Fillon promotes a liberal economic programme ending the 35-hour workweek, abolishing the wealth tax, and reforming the health insurance system. The far-right Marine Le Pen always insists on the national interests of France and an exit from the Eurozone.
Well, let's get you the latest on those French elections now. And I'm joined from Paris by Kate Parkinson. Also joining us is Dan Williams. He's at the headquarters of the controversial candidate Marine Le Pen. Kate, first to you though, let's start off with you. What's the early turnout looking like for this election?
We don't have any official turnout figures, but certainly this morning the polling stations here in Paris at least have been extremely busy. Some of them have had queues outside the door as people line up waiting to cast their ballots. This is not hugely unusual. Voting is not compulsory here in France, but presidential elections often get very high turnout, sometimes around 80%. So that's the expected turnout rate. We should have early turnout figures shortly, but certainly just by observing the number of people queuing to cast their ballots, it does look like we are on track for a high turnout in this presidential election. Overseas, in France's overseas territories, they started voting yesterday, also in some areas of the United States and Canada. And again, it does seem like there's been a high turnout there in Montreal, in Quebec, for example. French media were reporting long queues up to 2 kilometers outside some polling stations, with some people queuing for 3 hours to cast their vote. So certainly people here in France, and also in France's overseas territories, and French people living overseas, very engaged in this. This has been a very exciting presidential race. As you said, it's extremely tight at the top, very unpredictable. This could go any way, but certainly where we are in Paris, people are definitely wanting to have their voices heard, casting their ballots in this first round election here in France today.
Right. Dan, you're at the headquarters of Marine Le Pen. What's the mood there like? What's the atmosphere?
Well, Marine Le Pen will be here a little later this afternoon. At the moment, there's a lot of security here, and a lot of the world's media starting to turn up now and get into position ahead of her arrival. About an hour ago, she did cast her vote at the polling station around 2 kilometers or so away from here in the town centre of Henin-Beaumont. But certainly there is a sense, I guess, of expectation. There is a real expectation at least that she will get through this first round, but there is also some fear, there is a little trepidation as well among her supporters here that perhaps given the extraordinary nature of this French election that you know, there is a concern that she may not get through this first round. So certainly there is though this feeling that perhaps this year this election could be something a bit more special. We've seen this rise of populism both in the UK with the vote of Brexit as well as in the US. So there is a feeling perhaps that this could be her time, but at the same time there is this fear that of course with 4 key candidates, all with a great chance of reaching that second round of voting, that perhaps it's also a step into the unknown.
Well, Kate, of course, security is a top priority there, and there are about 50,000 police and 7,000 soldiers to be deployed during this election. Talk us through the security preparations and the presence at these elections countrywide.
Well, as you said, tens of thousands of police officers mobilised across the country, backed up by soldiers. Certainly security a big issue here in France. Of course, we saw a policeman being murdered on the Champs-Élysées here in Paris just a few days ago. But this was always going to be an election that took place amid tight security. Even before that, very timely reminder of the looming shadow, this long shadow of a threat of terror that has been cast as a result of Thursday's incident. France has had a string of terror attacks though in recent years, and really has had this state of emergency in place now for nearly 18 months. So even before that incident, that tragic death of a policeman on Thursday evening, this was always going to be an election that took place amid tight security, as there is a very real and ongoing fear here in France, suddenly among the security agencies, that there could be further attacks really at any time.
Right. Dan, of course, immigration and migration from Africa is a big issue here on the continent, particularly with the crossings across the Mediterranean. What do we know about Le Pen's migration policies toward Africa?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that if Le Pen were to become the French Prime Minister, then French President, that there would be no doubt that, that it would be very bad news indeed for all immigrants. Certainly, she's published a 144-point plan where she talks about how that free healthcare, free education would be stopped for any immigrant, that employers would be taxed for employing immigrants and foreigners. So certainly this would no doubt be really bad news for immigrants and foreigners as a whole. Added to that, she's also been outspoken in terms of public religious artifacts, so wearing of headscarves, etc., very much pointed towards Muslims, and she really says that there is no place for that in French society. It would create very much an us and them. She wants to bring back the borders, she wants to stop the Schengen zone, she wants to stop immigrants from coming to France, and so she's very clear on all of those points, and that has played out to a certain extent across much of France. She has gained support from that. She's softened it to a certain degree, but certainly it is a key policy for her going forward.
And of course, Kate, France still maintains close ties with its former colonies in Africa particularly, and there are more than 30 countries that are part of that Francophone grouping. Have any of the candidates touched on African candidates in their campaign? African countries in their campaign?
Well, France, of course, has a very long and complicated history with its former colonies, and certainly Algeria is one country in particular that politicians often focus on, particularly in their race to the Élysée Palace, and this year has been no different. But certainly the rhetoric from the various different candidates has been wildly different. On the one hand, we've heard the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, for example, saying that colonisation was a good thing for Algeria. That certainly didn't go down very well with the Algerians living here in France. As you just heard Dan mention, she has this very strong anti-immigration message, so really not much popularity for her among France's immigrant communities. They do seem to be quite liking, though, the centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron. He made waves really in February when he spoke to an Algerian TV station and described France's colonial period in Algeria as a crime against humanity. That certainly won him some fans among the 1 million Algerian voters. And actually, with this being such a tight race among the top four, perhaps it could even be those Algerian voters that tip the balance in favour of Emmanuel Macron. So certainly a very interesting relationship and very different views from those top two candidates, Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron, when it comes to one of France's particularly violent periods of colonial history.
Right, and of course, Dan, a final comment from you, and we did hear earlier on from Kate regarding that policeman who was killed last Thursday. To what extent, though, has that killing of the police officer added momentum to the Le Pen campaign?
Well, certainly Le Pen is seen as being so-called strong on security. She wants to build back the borders in France. She wants to stop the immigration, but she wants to gain control of those borders as well to stop terrorists from reaching France. And certainly that has played out in terms of Donald Trump suggesting that almost giving his backing as well to that kind of policy, and that will of course gain some popularity to France, that has obviously witnessed these terrible atrocities over the last couple of years, wave after wave, and people calling for answers. Of course, the reality is that it's a much more complex case than that, and there are questions as to whether having that kind of security would have any effect. We've seen other areas with that kind of security, with those kind of borders, unable to protect against these kind of attacks. But it's still, in terms of the voters, in terms of this election, it certainly is a strong message, and one that could very much play out. And of course we will know in the coming few hours or so as to whether that is indeed the case.
Right, Dan Williams there at the Le Pen headquarters, and Kate Parkinson joining us from Paris. To you both, thank you.